Well, good morning. It's good to be here with you. My name is David Black. I'm the campus pastor here. If we've not met, just welcome again to Grace Church. Something we say often here is that this is part of the gathering where we open up God's heart. That's what we call this, and we see what his heart has to say about our heart. And that can mean a lot of different things. And so if you're a follower of Jesus, what we hope that means for you is that God actually speaks to you. That he talks to you, maybe he challenges you, or maybe he calls you to a certain direction or maybe way that you could look like him. If you're not a follower of Jesus, here's kind of our hope for you that he would also talk to you in that moment. And maybe that, if anything, you would leave here with a group of people in which to explore maybe questions that you have about God, or even exploring questions you might have about Jesus. And if you're not a follower of Jesus, I would just say this, thank you for allowing us to be part of that conversation in your life. We know that's not something that you arrive at quickly. So we today are wrapping up a conversation in a series that we've been in out of this section of Scripture that we've just called Two Ways to Live. And in a moment, I'm going to tell you a little bit about that and then tell you where we're going to wrap up for it. But before I do, I want to let you know where we're going, okay? So next week, something pretty great is happening. We are taking our first attempt to be an open gathering and kind of just a place for our community to have a conversation around mental health. And so just real quick story about my life. I graduated from seminary, started doing ministry in a town in which the economy and families had just been devastated. And so I got out knowing a lot about Jesus, but not a lot about people in that regard. And so I started encountering just a lot of issues with mental health. And so my story was this, not just like for me mental health, but other people having mental health issues. I didn't necessarily know how that lined up with the Bible, and I also didn't know how to help. And so if you're going, man, I don't know how to help, and there's someone like that in my life, or maybe I struggle with that. What does the Bible have to do with that? We've partnered with 4 different people in our community, 4 different practices who are all centered around the Bible. And we're going to have a panel on Saturday. We're going to have some breakout discussions. I'd encourage you to register to that. This is not just a commercial. This is hey, this is for you and your community to do that. So there's still spots available. I'd encourage you to register for that. And then Sunday, we're going to actually sit down with a guy who's a pastor of marriage and care at one of our other campuses. He and his wife, we're going to hear their story about walking through mental health struggles with the church and kind of how God used his good news to be good news to them in that. And then we'll start a series entitled It Hurts, and what it means to actually take our pain to Jesus. Okay, so I know that was a lot, but I just want to let you know that's where we're headed in case you got plans coming up and you kind of want to prioritize where you are in all that. Today, we're ending a series, as I said, just called Two Ways to Live. And in that series, we've just been saying this, that as people, it's common for us and it's comical to put people into 2 different categories. Cat people, dog people, right? Then there's sports people, and then non-sports people. And then there's oh, hey, you cut your sandwiches in half, and you cut them diagonal. And then we just can go on and on and on and on and not. People we like, people we don't like, introverts, extroverts, right? And it would be unfair for us to say that that's all people, right? We've said that there's a large spectrum of people probably in between those 2 categories. So who would be so bold as to put people into 2 categories? Well, the answer to that is Jesus. Every time you meet Jesus, every time you watch Jesus, he drives people to a decision about what he's doing or about what he's saying. And so we've spent weeks since Easter talking about how things that he did, the cross and Easter, man, there's 2 ways to look at that. Jesus is trying to put us into 2 different categories. And then we said, hey, not only that, but in the things that he said, and he starts talking about 2 roads and 2 types of teachers and 2 types of disciples, and we just said, what would it look like to allow us to be shaped and pushed by Jesus into one of those categories? As uncomfortable as that might be, what if we let him do that and see where that led? And so today, Jesus wraps up not only his most famous sermon, but Jesus wraps up our sermon series for us in talking about another category of 2 different things. And it's called 2 builders. Very famous. If you grew up in church, you probably heard it. Even if you didn't grow up in church, you may have heard about it, and we've been singing about it already this morning. Here's what Jesus says at the end of his famous sermon called the Sermon on the Mount. He's been talking for 3 chapters of a book of the Bible called Matthew. One of his followers wrote down what he said. That's what we have for us. We're going to look in Matthew chapter 7. Here's what Jesus does when he ends a sermon. He says this, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house. And it fell, and great was the fall of it." At 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, 1912, something impossible happened. The unsinkable ship sank. She was the prize ship of the White Star Line and sailed from Northampton, England, carrying many passengers aboard. Most of its trip, everything had gone according to schedule until Sunday night. About 11 messages had come in throughout the day of impending danger from ships that were in the midst of ice fields. All of them were ignored. Many actually didn't make it to the captain's attention. At 11 p.m. on Sunday night, the wireless operator, John Phillips, received a direct warning call from the California. It was a ship, which was 10 miles away in the midst of some very large ice. In fact, you can see the wireless operating room. That is the wireless telegraph and the operating room in the upper right-hand corner there. John Phillips, who was at that very desk that very night, was tired. He'd been sending messages back and forth to America all day from people. So he cavalierly tapped this back. "Shut up, shut up. I'm busy." 40 minutes later, the beloved ship of the White Star Line collided with an iceberg, and the Titanic sank to the ocean floor. Now, you might say, what does that have to do with our text? But what that story talks about and what Jesus brings to our attention this morning is the same thing. Jesus says this, the difference between a warning and wisdom is what we do with what he says. That's what he says. The difference between a warning and wisdom is what we do with the message that he's giving us. And now you might be sitting here going, well, why does that matter today? Well, here's why I think it just matters. I was thinking about this week. We live, you live, I live, we live in a time where there is tons of info. In fact, scholars would tell you that we live in a time when we have the most amount of information ever as people. Knowledge is doubling at a rate of 12 hours. 12 hours. That means when you go to bed tonight, the knowledge in the world right now that exists at this moment will have doubled. That's crazy. Think about all the knowledge and information that you have available at your fingertips right now, in your pocket, in your hand, on your device. You can look up tons of things that it would take people to learn a lifetime. We can watch and learn and know about, and yet, here's what I've just observed as a pastor, and maybe you have too, that in a world filled with information, we are a people that lack transformation. And Jesus starts to talk about this. And he tells a story. So we're going to look at that story. And here's the analogy in the story that he gives. Here's what he's saying. First, I think he's saying this. Everybody is busy building something. We are all busy building something. Look at how he begins his story. He says this, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. But notice, he also says, everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. Notice, Jesus doesn't say, hey, there are people in this world who are building and there are people in this world who aren't. What does he say? Hey, there's two types of people building. Everybody is busy building. In fact, he talks about this and he says, everybody's got a goal. And the goal that he's pointing out in this story is literally a house. Everybody's got a house. Now, houses in those days were a little bit different than ours. A house back then would have been the central operation of your world. And so if you were a guy or a dad or a husband or even just a single man, you would work out of your home. There was no office building to go to. There was no manufacturing plant. You worked out of your home. That's what you did. You were with your family. It's working from home. We're just going backwards in time. That's all we're doing now, right? Like, you work from home. Not hard to imagine these days, right? That's what you would do. It was the center of your world. If you were a spouse, it's kind of weird. Education happened in that world. The family was all there. Multi-generations lived in homes at a time. It's not uncommon for people to be in a home with several, maybe 1, 2, 3 generations. And so really the house became the metaphor for life. That's really what it was. And Jesus is going, everyone has a house. You've got a house. If you don't own a home, I rent, doesn't matter. You have a house. You got a life, right? You have something that you're achieving, some goal. In fact, in the Bible, we see this example of this kind of metaphor all throughout the Bible. In the Proverbs, it says this, notice, by wisdom, the wisest of women builds her house, but folly with her own hands tears it down. Later on in Proverbs 24, it says this, by wisdom a house is built, and by understanding it is established. God, talking about Moses, like an Old Testament prophet, says this about him. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. God's not talking about his literal house. He's talking about what he was doing and what his life was about. God comes to David, a famous king in the Old Testament, and says this. He says, and your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. He's not saying, hey, right now there is a place and a home that you dwell in that will live forever. He's saying your life, the things that you do right now will last forever. They're never going to end. This house is a goal. And whether you have a real house or not, you and I have one. We have a goal. People everywhere are busy building. We're building brands. We're building companies. We're building bank accounts. We're building families. We're building marriages. We're building education. You're building a career. We can go around this circle. We won't this morning, but we can just point and say, what are you building? What are you busy building? Guarantee today, you'll talk to somebody and say, how are you doing? And they'll say, I'm good. You say, well, man, I haven't seen you. Yeah, I'm busy. Well, what are you busy? And then they will begin to talk to you about what they are busy building. They may not put it that way, but they'll talk to you about that. Your whole life tells a story about a house or a certain thing that you are busy building. And Jesus says we're no different than these two people. We are building something. More than that, Jesus goes, not only is everyone busy building and they have a goal, but they also have the same information and access to the information. Look at what he says. He goes, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house. Okay, house is the same, but notice there's another similarity here, words. Both these types of individuals hear his words. In other words, they have access to the same information there. Right? I think we got a slide. There you go. Yep, words. You can see that's parallel. And you might say, well, I'm not a follower of Jesus. Well, okay, but there's access to that, right? We have access, as we said earlier, to so much information. In fact, what words is Jesus talking about? Well, he's talking about this sermon. So back in Matthew chapter 5, he begins this sermon, and here's how he begins it. He goes, man, blessed, happy, fulfilled are these types of people. And he starts talking about what it means to build a fulfilling life. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. He's laying out kind of a picture of what life looks like. And then later on, he'll say, hey, you may have heard it said in the law, and he starts to talk about laws that they would have been familiar with. And he says, but here's what I tell you. And he talks about what it means to do things with what he tells them. And so he's talking about and saying, you've all heard kind of this plan. A plan for a house or a plan for a building is called a blueprint. And whether you know it or not, you have a blueprint. You say, well, I don't got a blueprint. I don't know what I'm doing, right? Well, even so, if you're building something, there is probably a blueprint somewhere behind it. Even if it's not, if it's the opposite of that, that's your blueprint. Like, hey, my blueprint is that my marriage would not be like my parents' marriage, right? Maybe that's the blueprint, right? My blueprint is that I'm not going to make the same mistakes, right? You're like, I don't know what that is, but I know that's it. Well, that's your blueprint, right? Everybody in this room is busy building something, and here's the truth. Every one of us has a blueprint. What is a blueprint? Well, a blueprint is notes from the architect, or notes from the designer, or notes from people who have gone ahead of it, saying, here's what it looks like to have something in the right relationship with another thing. You want these things close together, or you want these things far apart. Make sure that you put windows in your home. That'd be good, right? Make sure that you don't burn things down. Like, it has notes and instructions on how you build. Blueprints cover the entire length of the building project, right? You don't start with them and go, well, we're done with those, and throw them out, right? You need them throughout. Blueprints contain details for what you're building, and also blueprints tell you when you're done building, right? It says, when this matches that, you're done. Jesus is like, both these people have a goal. Both these people who are building, just like you and I, have blueprints. They've got the same access to info. And then he says there's also something else going on here that's the same with people who are busy building, and that's this. He looks at it in chapter 7, verse 25 and 27. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. And then he says the exact same thing about the other house. That is more than just a weather report. That is a storm. And more than just a weather report that's a storm, it's a metaphor for the environment in which we are building. Jesus is saying this, it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when calamity or disaster or difficulty will occur in your life. That's what he's saying. Notice he's not saying there's a wise person who built his house on a rock and there was no storms. It was just the rain's gone and it's sunny all the time, despite what Christian bookstores might make you think, right? Like, it's not sunny all the time. There's problems. Someone has said this about people. We are all, at one point in time, in this room, simultaneously in the middle of a storm, coming out of a storm, or heading into one. This is the nature of life. And yet, Jesus goes, when it happens, it's going to feel like it comes from every direction. Notice, winds, they come from the right, from the left. Where does rain come from? The sky. Where do floods come from? Below. And he's saying there's a point in your time when what you're building and what you have a blueprint for is going to be tested, and it's going to feel like it's coming from every single direction. Why is he bringing this up? Why is he talking about this at the end of his sermon? Well, I think they're like you and me, because people are people. And here's what I know about you, and I know this about you because I know this about me. When I'm actually busy building, here's the temptation I have. I tend to focus on the busy and forget to even ask the question, what am I building? And so maybe you're here this morning, and maybe as we're talking, this sign might pop up in your mind and in your life. Coming soon. You ever drive by one of these? What are they putting in over there? There's a Whataburger going in Kennesaw. If you don't know what that is, you should look it up, right? But they put it, now it's coming soon, Whataburger. You're like, oh, yes, right? Or whatever your favorite restaurant is, it's moving in. You're like, right? What? Just curious. What does your sign read? Like, well, I haven't really thought about that. People driving by your life, they're passing by your life. What's coming soon? What is it you're working on to build? What's interesting back then, houses were never bought. They were seldom bought. Most houses were built, and the reason they were built is because they were passed down from generation to generation to generation. In other words, they keep going. And the interesting thing about that is nobody built a house back then with the intention that it would fall apart and decay. It's not how it worked. And we're the same way. We don't build our lives expecting them to end. We don't build our marriage going, well, I'm going to start this and hopefully it collapses. If you do, that's a bad way to start one. You don't open a bank account going, well, that'll never have any money in it, right? That's not how, we don't have kids going, well, we'll see what happens. It's not, you build hoping and praying and planning and thinking. And Jesus goes, because of that, you need to know something more. Not only are we all busy building, but he says this, we all must look beneath the surface. Notice what he talks about these houses. They're very similar, same goal, same blueprint, same storm, but something's different. He says, listen, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Not a rock, not rocks, the rock. That's interesting. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. What? Not just sand? No, the sand. What's the deal with that? Well, he's talking about a certain type of foundation. What's a foundation? Well, think about it. A foundation is what you build first. A foundation is below the surface. It's where the construction starts, and everything else is set on top of that. And here's what you know. If your foundation's off a little bit, down here, up there, it's way off. Right? It's what you build first. It's what you build on top of, and it's what you continually base everything else on. Everything else follows it. Foundations aren't flashy. If you've ever built anything and they told you how much it's going to cost to put money in the ground, you're going, do we have to put that much money under the ground? Because I got like some fixtures for my bathroom that I would like to have above the ground that I can't afford if we put that much money in the ground. And the builder will go, we need that money in the ground. Otherwise, you will not have any money, no point in spending money above the ground. Not flashy, yet they need to be there. And Jesus goes, everybody's got a foundation. They're not very visible. This is literally the layout of how we build skyscrapers. If you went down to Midtown Atlanta or Atlanta in the center city, you'd find tall buildings reaching really, really like massive stories. Well, below that, they've constructed a foundation. And so you've got topsoil, subsoil, and bedrock. So when Jesus talks about the rock, he's talking about bedrock, right? So he's talking about one category called like rock. Like I got a bar, you can see it up there on the screen in case you're confused on what we're talking about. That's it, right there. That's what we're talking about. Now notice, they're drilling all the way down through the other soils to get to the rock. And they're like, all right, we're going down so that we can build up. Think about what are the qualities of that rock? Well, it's stable, right? It's solid, and it doesn't move. There's a time in my life, in my wife's life, when things were pretty difficult for us in marriage. And we had a close friend who said something to us, and I'll never forget what she said. She said this, it sounds like God is pouring concrete into your marriage. And then she said this, and the good thing about concrete is that when you fall on it, it hurts, but it doesn't move. Well, that was interesting. And so Jesus is saying, hey, there's a thing that doesn't move. It's solid. It's stable. And wise people build on it. And then he says, there's another thing that's different than that, and that's sand. Notice sand is very, very shallow. It's easy to get to. There's not a lot of time that's required, not a lot of energy that's required, not a lot of intentionality. The thing about sand is it's the opposite of stable and solid. It takes the shape of everything you put it in, right? At the same time, it shifts. The wind blows it. If you've ever been to the beach or the Middle East or the desert, you know sand dunes move. Just crazy to think about. These little tiny particles being spread everywhere. And so that's an option. It's loose. And Jesus is basically saying, in other words, look, the difference between what lasts and what's left is called a foundation. He says that. On that, talking about the house that was on the rock, and all the storm came, it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. Talking about the exact same storm on the opposite house, it says what? And it fell, and not just that it fell, and great was the fall of it. Like we're not talking about it got some hairline fracture. We're talking about like it collapsed. Now what's interesting is that we know this because we're being told the story. But if you were just to look at those houses, like if you ever just these two houses, here's the issue. You don't know what it's built on just by looking at the house. You don't. In fact, those two houses probably look the same. Maybe different paint color, maybe different fixtures, but a house can look very much the same until when? Until the storm comes. The storm shows what's underneath, which means this, not all the time, but often. Difficulty is not the cause of issues. difficulty often reveals the issue. It often exposes in us areas in which our life, although it might have looked the same, might be a little bit different in different places than somebody else. It wasn't visible until now, which is very interesting to me because everybody in this world that you look at, we're all busy building lives, some extravagant lives. Online, influencers, we just want extravagant lives. And Jesus is saying that it's possible to construct for ourselves extravagant lives that are extravagant lives. There you go. Because we would be building them on something that does not last. And here's why this is so important. Because we live in a time and place that is very interested in platforms. Everybody wants a platform. But what we need is a foundation. That's what we need. And now maybe you're sitting here and you're going, okay, great. Now this is the part where you're the pastor and you tell me that God is the foundation. Because we sang that song and I already know where this is going, right? And so it's Jesus. And so how about we just pray and we get done with it, right? Like maybe that's where we're going. And I would say you're kind of right. I mean, you're kind of right. The Bible talks about God and Jesus being the foundation. In fact, in 1 Peter, Jesus is called the cornerstone. Peter says this in chapter 2, verse 6. He says, hey, behold, I'm laying in Zion. That's another name for Jerusalem. A stone, a cornerstone. That would have been the first one that they laid. Everything else takes its measurements off of that. Chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him. Oh, what's up with this? What do you mean him? Well, Jesus will not be put to shame. Paul, literally writing to the Corinthian church, calls Jesus the foundation. Look at what he says. He says, let each one take care how he builds upon it, for no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is, drum roll, Jesus, right? No surprise there. Yet, is Jesus simply saying, hey guys, there's a wise and foolish builder. The wise builder builds on me. The foolish builder doesn't? No. He doesn't just say, I'm the cornerstone. What does he say is what makes a foundation the rock or the sand? What's he say? Look at what he says. He says, everyone who hears these words and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. He says this, everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. That's a little different, isn't it? In other words, it seems like Jesus is tying the line between the foundation of our life and who he is with a tether called action. He says, what matters in your life is whether you are building wisely or foolishly. And you want to know the difference between a wise person and a warning and a foolish person? It's whether or not they act on the words that I say, which means, man, we all have a choice. Every one of us in this room has a choice on how we build and whether we listen. In fact, in this verse, this word to do is this word poeo, and it's all throughout the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, in the last half of chapter 7, the chapter that we've kind of been in, it's mentioned 10 times. And the reason I say that is because they didn't exactly have all the paper in the world and all the ink in the world. It cost money to write, and paper was costly, so they don't just spend words like that. He's not just talking poetically. That's a thread. That's all the way throughout Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And the word poeo means, as you would expect, to make or to practice. And he's saying, hey, the difference is whether you do what I'm saying. And he actually talks about this. So a few weeks ago, when we talked about false teachers and true teachers, we said, hey, you could tell whether they're false or true by the type of fruit that they bear. That word, look at this in verse 18. It says this, a healthy tree cannot, that word, guess what that word is? Poeo. A healthy tree cannot practice bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree poeo, good fruit. And then last week we talked about what does it mean to be a true disciple? And Jesus says this, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who, poeo, the will of God, my Father, who's in heaven. And so what Jesus is doing is he's weaving this conversation about what it means to live a life in his kingdom. And then at the end, here's what he's doing. He's pulling on the thread. He's tightening it up. And that gets uncomfortable for us because we're like, man, we got to choose on where we're going to land with that. It's a little bit like Psalm 1. Psalms is in the Old Testament. It's a book of the Bible in which it would be the song book for Israel. And it starts off in a very famous way. What's interesting is it starts off and reflects the same way that Jesus starts his Sermon on the Mount. So Psalm 1, it starts like this. It says, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, or stands in the way of sinners, or sits in the seat of scoffers. What would we call that? Poeo. Practicing. Blessed, happy, fulfilled. Remember that language? Fulfilled is the man who practices not, and he lists all these things. But his delight, or her delight, is in the law of the Lord. That's a fancy way for saying the word of God. And on his law, he meditates day and night. See what's going on here? Jesus is like, blessed, fulfilled. Here's what it looks like. And the one who hears my what? Words. Yeah. Well, what happens? What's the quality of the person who does that? Look at what Psalm 1 says. He is like a house. No, he is like a tree planted by the streams of water that yields its fruit in season. Its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. What would you say that? Would you say that's solid? Yeah. Would you say that that's not going to move? Right. Would you say that that's stable? Yeah. Would you say that's kind of like a house that was built on rock? Yeah. Does that mean that that tree doesn't have any dry seasons? Nope. But guess what? It lasts. See what Jesus is driving at? Now, I think there's two implications here. Two implications for us, and we're wrapping this series and going home. First thing is this. I think this means that it's possible to possess a life full of godly intentions, yet empty of godly actions. Jesus is saying this, that it's possible to be professional hearers. It's possible to listen and hear and know God's word, to memorize it, to hear it, and yet not act on it. I was in college, and I was taking a class for credit because I needed it to graduate. And in this class, I noticed there were some people who did not look like me. They were older than me. Nothing wrong with being older, but I thought, like, why are you here? It's literally what I thought, because I was foolish and young, right? I'm like, what are you doing in this college class? And I found out they were auditing the class, which means they could sit in the class. In fact, here's what that meant. It meant that they could come from the community and attend the class and hear the professor talk on whatever it was that the professor was talking about. And that couple, those people, man, here's what you need to know about them. They were in class more than I was in class. And I was the one taking it for credit, right? They were there. And I thought, man, they're really dedicated to this. Someone should give them a degree, right? But they don't. Right? I was there because I had to take the class because they made me take the class. They were there for fun. And what I found out is that they were doing the exact same thing until it came time to take the tests and do the projects. Because when you audit a class, the tests don't matter because you're not taking it for credit. And the projects are optional. Wow, that's amazing. Can I do that? No, because then you won't get credit. It's like, okay, fine. Look, Jesus is saying it's possible to audit Christianity. That you and I might find his words as opinion or as options rather than something to be obeyed. James puts it this way. Man. Hey, that's mine. He didn't say that. Hey, be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourself. And as we can trick ourselves into thinking, I hear the Bible, 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 but yet nothing's coming out. What's going on? And Jesus is like, you're not applying it to your life. Or, let me put it this way, you have built a box around reality in your life. A wall, a defense. You're saying, I like what you say, but I will not live that way. That's one way. Okay, here's another thing I think we could take away from this, and that's this, that DIY doesn't work. Jesus is saying every other foundation that you build is going to fail. You need someone to direct your life. Now, listen, what are we, 21st century Westerners? We don't like that. Because here's what we've been told our whole life. We direct our life. And in fact, DIY exists because I don't want to pay someone to do the work. I will collect the things, I'll get the information, and I'll just begin to do it, right? I don't need the professional there to tell me how to do it. And Jesus is literally going, you need me to do my things. That's what you need. Think about this. Jesus, in Sermon on the Mount, you know what he talks about? He talks about loving your enemies. He talks about forgiving people who hurt you. He talks about the emptiness of like just plain religion. He's like, don't do church stuff to make people like proud and like love you. Do it because you really want to be authentic. He talks about authenticity. He talks about not worrying. He talks about time management. He talks about prayer and like all of that stuff. He talks a lot about what the next day will bring and how to handle your money. He talks about like these things that we in our Western society, we go, oh, we love that. That's great. We love the idea of forgiving people. Like we have these values, and yet, here's what we think. We think we can build our lives without the one from whom those values come. So yeah, I'll love my neighbor, and yeah, I'll be kind to my person who's being angry at me, and we all think that we should love each other and forgive each other. We all think that we should act certain ways that we've co-opted from the kingdom, but you know what we've done? We've kicked out the king. Because I don't need a director. I'm going to DIY it myself. You just want to say, what is the history of Western civilization? What is secularism right now? It is literally living today with the values of Jesus without Jesus. And what does he say? Well, Psalms 127 puts it this way. It says, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Jesus puts it this way. Everyone then who hears these words of mine, whose words are they? His. Man, I wish he didn't say that. Hey, everyone who hears these words, no words of mine, they're mine. You need me. In other words, I am the difference between wise and foolish action and building. Listen, every one of us, we're building something. We're busy. Every one of us has some sort of foundation, and every one of us has to choose. Jesus also said this one time he was talking to his disciples. He says this in John 14, verse 6, and here's what he says. Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. He puts us into categories. And here's the thing. Jesus is saying this. There are two ways to live, but there's only one way to life. And that's through him. Because when given the choice, he chose death on a cross. The same thing that, listen, we as humanity have been choosing death our entire life. That's what we do. Every chance we get. From a garden with a life tree and death tree, we choose death. Here's the law of the Lord. I choose set before you life and death. Which one are you going to choose? We're like, we'll take death. Jesus goes, I'll take death so that the people who have always taken death might take life for eternity, beginning today. He pushes that on us. He makes us decide. Recently, last story and I'm done. Like last week, there's a plane traveling to Florida. Maybe you heard about this in the news. And the pilot has a medical emergency and just gone. And the person who sits behind the seat is just a person, just like you and me, not a pilot, never flown a plane, zero knowledge. So they get on the conversation, what is it called? The radio, thank you. Just left. I thought radar, and I was like, that's not right. They got on the radio with this guy, and it's like, I don't know, Doug from Illinois. Like, hey, Doug. Hey, okay, we're going to get you down. And they get this guy, and he has to talk him from, like, no knowledge. Okay, there's things called wings. Right? Okay, there's wings. Right, all right. Yeah, okay. You're in the air, and you got that stick in front of you. And I can't imagine what that conversation is like. You need a red dial-y thing. You find it? I don't know. It's orange. Well, that's it. Okay. You know, like that whole deal. They clear the runway for him at Palm Beach. So you got American airline pilots. They're literally the guys with schooling and education and knowledge watching Doug, I don't know if that's his real name or not, we'll call him Doug. Doug land in the plane in Palm Beach. Now this guy on the radio is talking to Doug and he's telling him, hey, he's giving him step-by-step instructions. Doug could have been like, I've never met you before, I've never seen you, I'm not really sure you exist. Could have said that. He said, Doug, I need you to go ahead and I need you to pull to the left, I need you to pull to the right. And he could have said, man, why are you trying to control me? He said, Doug, I need you to listen very carefully. I need you to manually go ahead and lift the flaps up, and then you're going to hear something. It's going to sound very scary. And he's like, I don't like that. That makes me very uncomfortable, and I'm not sure I'm okay with that. I don't feel safe. But he didn't do any of that. Doug listened, because Doug is a wise man. And he let someone else fly that plane through him. That's what Jesus is talking about. He's saying, how about you let me pilot your marriage, pilot your life, and pilot your eternity? Because I'm the one who knows how. And I'm the one who made it. Doug landed. Great landing. Doug listened. And more than listened, he obeyed. And what would it look like if churches actually did that? They probably wouldn't look like all the things that we build them into. They'd probably look like the houses that Jesus builds. Not flashy, but solid. Yeah. Let's pray and ask him to do that here. God, there's so much that you could probably be saying to us this morning. I imagine there's people here, Lord, who are thinking about their own life. How you've been talking to them on the radio this entire time, and you've been fighting you, and maybe they're considering allowing you to fly it. Just pray that you would give them the ability and the desire to hand over control to you. Maybe for the first time admit that they're not the best person to run their life. God, there's probably some of us here who are going, man, we haven't even considered you in our building. What are we building? What are we doing? God, speak to us. Make us people who obey you. Accept it by putting into action. Do the hard work of changing our hearts to follow you. Lord, thank you for the forgiveness that exists and the life that exists, yet even in our failings, because of the fact that you did not fail in what you came to do on the cross. Lord, make us into a church that's solid and stable, because we are people who actually do what you've asked us to do, because you are the director. God, we can't wait to see what you do. We can't wait to be in a kingdom that you've made, not us. It's in your name that we pray and ask this. Amen.